The air shimmered with tension as Zhara stepped into the ceremonial chamber, her heart hammering against her ribs. The thick, musky scent of the ceremonial oils clung to her blue-hued skin, a stark reminder of what was expected tonight. Her people, the Xyran, were a proud race, warriors with rigid codes of honor designed for survival in the harsh galaxy. She had never imagined her destiny would be tied to the fragile alliances of politics, let alone tethered to a human. Her gaze landed on him across the room. Commander Ethan Carter stood tall, his broad shoulders filling out the ceremonial tunic he'd been given. His pale skin seemed almost luminous under the soft ambient light, his angular jaw set with an unreadable expression. His dark brown hair was neatly combed back, and his green eyes locked onto hers with an intensity that made her breath hitch. There was no mistaking it. Ethan exuded raw, untamed strength, different from the practiced precision of Xyran warriors. This man was now her mate, chosen to end the centuries-long conflict between their species. As the elders of both their people chanted the union blessings, Zhara's stomach tightened. The translator chip embedded in her ear helped decipher the words, though they did little to calm the turmoil within her. She barely knew Ethan. Their only interaction had been a brief, tense negotiation that led to this pact, where his calm demeanor had infuriated her, even as it intrigued her. And now they were bound, the fate of both their worlds resting on the success of this fragile alliance. Do you, Zhara of the Xyran, take this human to be your bonded mate, to share in unity and life? The elder's voice boomed, resonating through the chamber. Zhara hesitated, her jaw tightening. She could feel the eyes of her people on her, their expectation a heavy weight. Ethan's gaze never wavered, silently willing her to answer. "I do," she said finally, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. "And you, Ethan Carter of Earth, do you take this Xyran to be your bonded mate, to share in unity and life?" "I do," he replied without hesitation, his deep voice resonant with confidence. The ceremony concluded with the sealing of their vows, a symbolic touch of their hands. Ethan's fingers were warm against hers, his skin softer than she expected. The moment lingered, their eyes meeting once again, and for a fleeting second, Zhara felt something unfamiliar, a spark, an acknowledgement of the undeniable pull between them. When the ceremony was over, the crowd erupted in a mix of cheers and subdued murmurs. The elders announced the end of the formalities, and Zhara's heart sank as she realized what came next. The wedding night. The chamber prepared for them was spacious and luxurious, adorned with soft silken tapestries and glowing crystals that emitted a calming light. The bed at the center was massive, draped in lush fabric, a stark reminder of the consummation that was expected. Zhara stood stiffly near the door, her arms crossed defensively over her chest as Ethan entered behind her. The door slid shut with a soft hiss, leaving them alone for the first time. "So," he began, his voice calm, "this is awkward." She turned to face him, her golden eyes narrowing. "Awkward? You think that is the correct term for this situation, human?" "Ethan," he corrected, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "And yes, Zhara, it's awkward. I'm sure neither of us signed up for this willingly." "No," she admitted, her voice sharper than she intended. "But here we are." Ethan stepped closer, his movements slow and deliberate. "Look, I get it. This isn't ideal. But if we're going to make this work for our people, maybe we start by getting to know each other. No expectations." Zhara raised an eyebrow, skepticism etched across her features. "You suggest we simply talk instead of fulfilling what is demanded of us tonight?" "Not just talk," he said, his green eyes scanning her face, lingering briefly on her full lips. "But I'd rather not rush this, would you?" Her defenses wavered as she considered his words. He was different from the men of her people, who saw vulnerability as weakness. There was something disarming about his honesty, and yet a flicker of frustration flared within her. Did he think her incapable of facing what lay ahead? "Humans," she muttered, stepping closer. "Always so delicate." Ethan's grin widened. "I wouldn't call myself delicate." "Prove it," she challenged, her tone laced with defiance. Before she could second-guess her actions, She closed the gap between them, grabbing the collar of his tunic and pulling him down into a kiss. His lips were warm, firm, and for a moment he seemed surprised, but he recovered quickly. His hands came up to cup her face, his touch firm yet careful, and he kissed her back with a hunger that matched her own. The kiss deepened, their breaths mingling as the tension between them ignited into something electric. Zhara's hands roamed over his chest, feeling the hard planes of his body beneath the fabric. Ethan responded in kind, his fingers tracing the contours of her back, sending shivers down her spine. "Zhara," he murmured against her lips, his voice husky with desire. Her name on his tongue sent a jolt through her. She pushed him back toward the bed, her confidence growing as she saw the desire in his eyes. His hands found her waist, pulling her closer as they tumbled onto the soft bedding together. Ethan shifted above her, his weight pressing her into the mattress as his lips trailed along her jawline and down her neck. Zhara arched into him, her body responding instinctively to his touch. Every brush of his skin against hers ignited a fire within her, one that she hadn't anticipated. She reached for him, her fingers tangling in his hair as she pulled him back up to kiss him again, this time slower, more deliberate. Ethan groaned into her mouth, his hands exploring the curves of her body with growing confidence. "You're incredible," he whispered between kisses, his words sending a thrill through her. For a moment, Zhara let herself get lost in the sensation, in the way his body fit against hers. The weight of their union, the expectations of their people, faded into the background as they gave in to the passion building between them. But just as things threatened to spiral out of control, Zhara placed a hand on his chest, stopping him. Both of them were breathing heavily, their faces inches apart. "Not yet," she said, her voice soft but firm. "If we're going to do this, we do it on my terms." Ethan nodded, his green eyes filled with understanding and something else. "Respect, all right," he said, brushing a strand of her dark hair away from her face. "Your terms." The silence between them was heavy but not uncomfortable. Zhara shifted beneath Ethan, her golden eyes holding his with a mix of challenge and curiosity. She felt her pulse pounding, her body still humming with the heat of his. Touch? There was something undeniably magnetic about him, his strength tempered by gentleness, his restraint a quiet promise of more. Ethan rolled onto his side, giving her space, but keeping close enough that their bodies brushed. "So," he began, his voice low and calm, "your terms. I'm listening." Zhara studied him for a moment, uncertain whether his patience was genuine. In Xyran culture there was no patience in matters of bonding, dominance and submission, were as natural as breathing. Yet this human, despite his physical power, showed no need to control her. "You don't like to take the lead?" she asked, her tone sharper than she intended. Ethan chuckled, propping himself up on one elbow. "Oh, I can lead, but I'm not here to prove anything to you. We're supposed to be partners, right?" The simplicity of his statement surprised her. Partners. It was a concept she hadn't considered in this arrangement. Mates were chosen for strength, for strategy. Partnership rarely factored into such unions. "You confuse me, Ethan Carter," she admitted, her voice quieter now. "Good," he said with a grin, his hand brushing a stray strand of hair from her cheek. "Keeps things interesting." Zhara felt warmth bloom under his touch. She leaned into his palm before she could stop herself, the tender gesture catching her off guard. "Humans are strange," she murmured, almost to herself. Ethan's smile softened. "And Xyrans are stubborn, but I think we can figure this out." Her lips curved into a faint smile despite herself. "Figure it out," she repeated, testing the phrase. "You make it sound so simple." "Sometimes it is," he said, his voice dropping an octave. He leaned closer, his breath warm against her ear. "It's about trusting instincts. Like this." He kissed her again, slower this time. Zhara felt herself relax under the weight of him, the earlier tension giving way to a different kind of energy. His hands traced the lines of her body, exploring without hesitation, but with an awareness that made her skin tingle. She responded in kind, her fingers slipping beneath the edge of his tunic to feel the hard planes of muscle beneath. His skin was warm, softer than she expected, and the steady rhythm of his heartbeat against her palm grounded her. "You're holding back," she said suddenly, her voice a mix of accusation and invitation. Ethan paused, his lips hovering over hers. "Am I?" "You're testing me, watching to see how far I'll let you go." He pulled back slightly, his eyes narrowing with intrigue. "And how far is that, Zhara?" Instead of answering, she pushed him onto his back, straddling him with a fluidity that made his breath catch. Her hands pressed against his chest, pinning him beneath her as she leaned down to study his expression. "This far," she said, her voice laced with confidence. Ethan's lips parted in a smile, his hands settling on her hips. "I like the way you think." Their connection deepened as Zhara took control, her movements deliberate and precise. She allowed herself to savor the sensation of his body beneath hers, the way his hands gripped her with growing urgency. The chemistry between them was undeniable, a force that neither of them could resist. Ethan's breath hitched as her lips trailed down his neck, her teeth grazing the sensitive skin just above his collarbone. His grip on her tightened, and Zhara reveled in the sound of his quiet groan. "Zhara," he murmured, her name a plea on his lips. The sound sent a jolt of satisfaction through her, and she slowed her movements, teasing him with deliberate pauses. "Yes?" she whispered, her lips brushing against his ear. "You're relentless," he said, his voice thick with amusement and desire. "Relentless," she echoed, a playful smile tugging at her lips. "Perhaps, but you seem to enjoy it." Ethan's laughter was low and breathless. "You're not wrong." The night stretched on as they explored each other's limits, their bodies moving in perfect harmony. The barriers between them began to crumble, replaced by a growing sense of mutual understanding and respect. Eventually, as they lay tangled together in the dim light of the chamber, Zhara found herself studying Ethan's face. He looked at peace, his green eyes half-lidded, a satisfied smile curving his lips. "You don't regret this," she said, her voice soft. "Do you?" he countered, his gaze steady. Zhara hesitated, her hand tracing idle patterns on his chest. "No, I don't." Ethan's smile widened, and he reached up to tuck a strand of hair behind her pointed ear. "Then we're off to a good start," she smirked, leaning down to press a kiss to his lips. "You're surprisingly optimistic for someone thrust into a political marriage." "Call it a human trait," he replied, his tone teasing. "We're stubbornly hopeful." Zhara shook her head, but the smile lingering on her lips betrayed her amusement. She settled against him, her head resting on his shoulder, as sleep began to pull at her. For the first time since the union was proposed, she felt a sliver of hope. Perhaps this alliance would work, not just for their people, but for them. As her breathing slowed and she drifted off, Ethan tightened his hold on her, his own thoughts echoing hers. They might not have chosen this path, but together they were, determined to make it their own. The dawn light filtered through the crystalline panels of the chamber, casting a soft glow over the bed where Zhara and Ethan lay entwined. Zhara stirred first, her senses sharpening as the remnants of sleep faded. She became acutely aware of Ethan's warmth beside her, his steady breathing a soothing rhythm. For a brief moment, she allowed herself to bask in the unfamiliar comfort of it, but reality soon intruded. She sat up slowly, the silk sheets pooling around her waist. Her gaze drifted to the ceremonial garments, discarded haphazardly across the room. The events of the night before came rushing back, every touch, every whispered word, every barrier that had fallen between them. Her lips pressed into a thin line as she glanced back at Ethan. He looked peaceful, his face relaxed in sleep. How could someone so utterly foreign feel so right? She pushed the thought aside and slid out of bed, her bare feet touching the cool floor. As she reached for her clothing, Ethan's voice stopped her. "Leaving already?" His tone was light, but there was an edge of curiosity beneath it. Zhara turned to find him propped up on one elbow, his green eyes sharp and alert. She crossed her arms over her chest, her expression carefully neutral. "Our people will expect us to present ourselves. The alliance cannot appear fragile." Ethan smirked, his gaze sweeping over her unapologetically. "Funny. Last night, You didn't seem too worried about appearances." Heat rose to her cheeks, but she refused to let him see her flustered. "Last night was necessary. For the bond." He raised an eyebrow, clearly unconvinced. "Necessary, huh? Is that what we're calling it?" Zhara's jaw tightened. "You find amusement in everything, don't you?" Ethan swung his legs over the edge of the bed, the sheet slipping away to reveal his toned form. He stood and approached her with deliberate slowness, the playful grin on his lips softening as he closed the distance between them. "Not everything," he said, his voice dropping to a more serious tone. "But you make it hard not to smile." His words caught her off guard and she looked away, unsure how to respond. Ethan reached out, his fingers brushing against her arm, drawing her gaze back to him. "Zhara," he said softly, "you don't have to keep pretending this is just duty. What we're building here, it's real, isn't it?" Her golden eyes searched his, and for the first time, she felt the full weight of his sincerity. He wasn't mocking her or challenging her. He was asking her to trust him. She began, but the words faltered on her tongue. Ethan didn't push her. Instead, he leaned in, his lips capturing hers in a kiss that was as tender as it was confident. Zhara melted into him before she could think to resist, her hands finding their way to his chest. His heartbeat steady and strong beneath her palm, grounding her in the moment. When they pulled apart, she rested her forehead against his, her breath coming in soft pants. "You're impossible," she murmured. "I've been told that," he replied with a chuckle. A sharp knock at the door interrupted their quiet moment. Zhara stiffened, her warrior instincts kicking in. She stepped back, reaching for her discarded robe, while Ethan casually pulled on his tunic. "Enter," Zhara called, her tone returning to its usual authority. The door slid open to reveal one of her attendants, a young Xyran with pale blue skin and wide, nervous eyes. "My lady, the council awaits your presence. They wish to see the bonded pair." Zhara nodded curtly. "We'll join them shortly." The attendant bowed and exited, leaving the door hissing shut behind them. Ethan turned to Zhara, his expression amused. "The council, huh? Think they're ready to meet their new favorite human?" Zhara sighed, pinching the bridge of her nose. "They're skeptical. Our people are not quick to trust outsiders." "Well," Ethan said, moving to stand beside. "Harasma, good thing I've got the best possible endorsement, my wife." Zhara shot him a look. "Don't call me that." He grinned, his hand brushing against hers. "What should I call you then? Partner? Mate? Commander of my heart?" She rolled her eyes, but a small smile tugged at her lips. "You're insufferable, and you're stuck with me." As they left the chamber together, Zhara couldn't help but notice the way their steps fell in sync, their movements mirroring each other naturally. Perhaps the bond was more powerful than she'd anticipated. The council chamber was a stark contrast to the intimacy of their quarters. It was a vast circular room with high ceilings, the walls lined with shimmering panels that reflected the light of the central holo display. Around the table sat the Xyran elders, their expressions a mix of skepticism and curiosity. Ethan squared his shoulders as they entered, his military training evident in the confident way he carried himself. Zhara walked beside him, her presence commanding as ever. "Lady Zhara," one of the elders began, his voice deep and resonant, "and Commander Carter, we are pleased to see you both." Ethan inclined his head respectfully. "It's an honor to stand before you." The elder's gaze lingered on Ethan. "The union you represent is vital to our future. But tell us, are you prepared to face the challenges it brings?" Ethan met the elder's eyes without hesitation. "Challenges are part of any alliance. I've spent my career facing the unknown. This is no different." Another elder leaned forward, her gaze sharp. "And what of your bond?" "It is said that the union between mates must be strong to ensure peace." Ethan glanced at Zhara, a small smile playing on his lips. "Our bond is strong," he said firmly, "stronger than you might think." Zhara felt a flicker of warmth at his words, but she quickly masked it. "Our bond will endure," she added, her tone decisive, "for the sake of both our people." The elders exchanged glances, murmuring among themselves. Finally, the lead elder nodded. "Very well. We shall see how this union shapes our future. For now, we trust you to uphold the bond." As the meeting concluded and they stepped out into the corridor, Ethan let out a low whistle. "Well, that was intense. They'll be watching us closely," Zhara said, her voice thoughtful. "We'll need to prove ourselves, not just to them, but to everyone." Ethan stopped, turning to face her. "Then we'll prove it together." For the first time, Zhara felt the weight of her doubts begin to lift. Together, the days following their formal appearance before the council were a whirlwind. Word of their union spread quickly among both the Xyrans and the humans, each faction watching them with a mix of hope and skepticism. Zhara and Ethan found themselves constantly in the public eye, attending meetings, appearing at diplomatic events, and offering reassurances that their bond would hold. But it wasn't just the external pressures they had to contend with. Each night, when the events of the day had ended and the demands of diplomacy had quieted, they returned to the chamber they now shared, and each night they navigated the complexities of their growing connection. Tonight was no different. Ethan leaned back against the plush couch in their quarters, his tunic discarded, leaving his chest bare. Zhara stood at the window, her arms crossed as she gazed out at the glowing spires of the Xyran capital. The tension between them was palpable, though neither seemed willing to address it outright. "You've been quiet all evening," Ethan said finally, breaking the silence. Zhara didn't turn, her reflection in the window revealing the faint crease of her brow. "There's much on my mind." Ethan rose, crossing the room to stand behind her. He didn't touch her, but his presence was a steadying force. "Care to share? Or is this one of those Xyran warrior secrets I'm not allowed to know about?" She sighed, her shoulders relaxing slightly. "It's not a secret, it's frustration." "Frustration with me?" She turned to face him, her golden eyes sharp. "No, with the council, the scrutiny, the weight of all this." She gestured, vaguely, encompassing the expectations that hung over them. "We are expected to be perfect, flawless, yet we're still learning how to be this." Ethan stepped closer, his hands settling on her arms. "Zhara, I get it. I do. But we don't have to be perfect. We just have to be us." "Us," she repeated, her tone almost skeptical. "Yes, us. You, me. Figuring this out together. The rest of the galaxy can wait." His words were simple, yet they carried a weight that cut through her doubts. She looked up at him, searching, his face for any hint of insincerity and finding none. "You make it sound so easy," she murmured. "It's not," he admitted with a wry smile. "But nothing worth having ever is." Before she could respond, Ethan tilted her chin up and kissed her. The kiss was different this time, deeper, more certain. It wasn't just about desire. It was about reassurance, about grounding her in the connection they'd built. Zhara responded in kind, her arms slipping around his neck as she pressed closer. The kiss intensified, their bodies molding together as the tension between them shifted into something far more urgent. Ethan's hands slid down her back, pulling her against him as they moved toward the bed. Zhara let herself get lost in the moment, her doubts and frustrations melting away under the heat of his touch. When they reached the bed, Ethan paused, his green eyes meeting hers. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice low and husky. Her answer was to pull him down onto the bed with her, her lips capturing his in a kiss that left no room for hesitation. They moved together with a rhythm that felt natural, as if their bodies had always been meant for this. Ethan's hands explored every curve of her body, his touch both reverent and possessive. Zhara arched beneath him, her breaths coming in soft gasps as he kissed his way down her neck and across her collarbone. "Ethan," she whispered, her fingers threading through his hair as she pulled him back up to meet her gaze. His eyes burned with intensity as he looked down at her. "I'm here," he murmured, his voice a promise. Their connection deepened with every touch, every kiss, every whispered word. The barriers between them had long since crumbled, leaving only the raw, unfiltered truth of their bond. They weren't just fulfilling an obligation, they were choosing each other over and over again. Hours later, as they lay tangled together in the aftermath, Zhara traced lazy circles on Ethan's chest. Her mind felt clearer than it had in days, her doubts replaced by a quiet sense of certainty. "You were right," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "About what?" Ethan asked, his fingers gently stroking her arm. "About us. About this." She paused, glancing up at him. "We can make this work." Ethan smiled, his hand tilting her chin so he could kiss her forehead. "I never doubted it." Zhara huffed a quiet laugh. "You're infuriatingly confident, you know that?" "It's one of my many charms," he said with a grin. They fell into a comfortable silence, the weight of the day forgotten as they simply enjoyed each other's presence. For the first time since their union, Zhara felt truly at peace. The weeks that followed were a testament to the strength of their bond. Together, they faced every challenge the alliance threw at them: skeptical leaders, cultural differences, the ever-present threat of sabotage. And each time they emerged stronger, their partnership unshakable. Their people began to see it too. The human diplomats who had doubted Ethan's ability to adapt were silenced by his unwavering commitment to the Xyran customs. The Xyran warriors who had questioned Zhara's choice of mate grew to respect Ethan's resilience and willingness to fight for their shared future. And through it all, Zhara and Ethan stood side by side, their bond a beacon of hope for both their worlds. On the night of their first joint celebration, a festival to commemorate the alliance, Zhara stood on the balcony of their quarters, gazing out at the city, bathed in the glow of the festivities. Ethan joined her, slipping an arm around her waist as they looked out together. "We did it," she said softly, a hint of wonder in her voice. "No," Ethan corrected, his lips brushing against her temple. "We're doing it." Together, Zhara leaned into him, her heart swelling with a feeling she hadn't dared to name before. She turned to face him, her golden eyes meeting his. "I choose you," she said, her voice steady. Ethan smiled, his green eyes warm. "And I choose you." Their lips met in a kiss that spoke of promises kept and futures yet to come. The stars above bore witness to their union, a testament to what could be achieved when two hearts defied the odds and chose love over division. This wasn't just a union for peace, it was the beginning of a legacy.